Well, Diane, thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate having you this morning and for being so willing to share all about the risks that are, at the forefront for all of us as it relates to tax policy and the scope of potential adverse changes that will definitely include all of those tax rules governing life and health insurance, annuities, retirement savings, employer provided benefits, all of the things that we work day in and day out to bring to our clients. For those of you that have not met Diane, she is the Senior Vice President of Government Relations for NAIFA. Her responsibilities include developing and implementing NAIFA's comprehensive state, interstate, and federal legislative and regulatory strategies. She joined NAIFA in 1991. Before expanding health and workplace benefit representation to all NAIFA members in 2010. She actually served as the Executive Vice President for the Association of Health Insurance Advisors, the former health conference of NAIFA. She is a proud Capitol level contributor to IFAPAC and works very closely with political affairs teams to develop strategy and programs to maximize NAIFA's grassroots efforts around the country. So we are very thankful to have you, very lucky to have you this morning. And with that, I will pass it off to you.
So as Lena was talking, I was like, oh my gosh, the anxiety of all of the issues that are up in the tax debate are real. So it's going to be a challenging year. The cost of extending the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is where sort of the starting point, which is really the push for why we have this massive tax bill coming in 2025. And if you look at the cost of that bill, it's roughly $4.5 trillion. So it used to be, we would say $1 million here, $1 million there, you're talking real money. We're now talking in the trillions of dollars. So it's significant. There are roughly $7.5 trillion in tax cuts that were there. There were tax increases of about $3 trillion. So the net cost of renewing that bill is $4.5 trillion. So the challenge and part of the reason why you see it expiring, why those provisions weren't made permanent, is because in 2017, when the TCJA went into effect, it was done through a process called reconciliation. And I'll talk about that a little further down the line, but that means that those provisions couldn't necessarily be made permanent. They had to be made temporary, which is why we're where we are now in 2025. And, couple that with the national debt, which gives people a little anxiety. We're at, $35 trillion there and growing. So adding another 4.5 trillion causes a number of the legislators to have pause about moving forward with this. Let's go on and talk about what if Congress just decided they're not going to do anything with this? Well, then you're going to see the tax rate, the individual rates revert back to 2017 levels. We'll see the standard deduction drops back, the SALT limitation, and that's actually a revenue raiser in the way that we look at the bill, because what they did is they put limits on the state and local tax deduction is what SALT is. You're going to see that in play because the states that generally take advantage of the SALT deduction are in high income states. So you're looking at New York and California. And if you think about politically where some of the seats are that are in contested challenges are in New York and California. So they're looking to appease those constituents in those states. And so there's pressure to say, no, we need to remove that limitation on the deduction. And if they do that, that cost for that $4.5 trillion goes up because you no longer have that revenue raiser offsetting the cost of the legislation. You'd see the child tax credits reduced. You'd see 199A deductions expire. The expensing rules revert back, and the credit for paid family and medical leave would expire. What isn't perfect, what isn't on that list because it was permanent was the corporate rate, but it will come back into play as you try to balance the cost of those bills. You can go ahead and move on. So when you start paying for it is when, now obviously there's some provisions that you probably just saw that you're like, oh, I'd like for those to stay, or I have some concerns with those changing. But the bigger change is when you get to where do you find the $4.5 trillion to pay for those provisions is where my heart races a little bit, because what they're going to do is look at what the government calls tax expenditures. And the way that the government looks at tax expenditures are at those provisions that if the tax rules were to change, it would generate revenue for the government. So they look at it as lost revenue to the federal government. 7 of the top 10 are in our industry and are of things that we care about. So if all they're doing as legislators is looking for revenue to offset that bill, they're going to look at our industry. So the challenge that we have is to make sure that they understand the benefits that come with it and not just the dollar signs. Let's go ahead and move on and dive a little deeper into that. So all of those provisions that are considered tax expenditures that are in our industry total roughly $6.3 trillion. So 65% of the tax expenditures are NAIFA related tax expenses. So let's continue and we'll break that down a little bit. So if you look at the income and retirement space, you're looking at $4.5 trillion. So who remembers how much it was to renew the TCJA provisions? $4.5 trillion. So if I'm a legislator, I could just wipe out all of these provisions and voila, I've paid for the extension of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. All of those provisions that are now no one's saying that. So I don't want to be an alarmist over somebody coming in and wiping out the retirement industry, because I do think that there's a general understanding that the retirement industry is good and that there needs to be some tax support there in order to continue those programs. But I want you to get into the mindset of that legislator if they're shopping for revenue. And so while they may not wipe out the industry in its entirety as far as the tax treatment of our products and services, they are going to look here and they are going to try to tinker with it. You flip to the next side, if you look in the insurance space, it raises another $1.8 trillion. So this is why I get nervous when we start talking about tax changes. Is this is where the revenue is. It's sort of like the old joke of why do robbers rob banks? Well, because that's where the money is. So if they don't understand the benefit that our products provide, it's really easy to go and attack the industry because that's where the money is. That's where they know they can generate revenue. Let's go on to talk a little bit about the election and how that's going to play, because the election really will shape what direction and how Congress looks at a tax bill. And one of the things that we're watching, if you look at the new Congress coming in, so currently we're in the 118th Congress, 119th is what we'll vote on in November. They'll take office in January. But if you look at just the 118th Congress, over 57% of the House members were elected after 2017. Meaning they didn't go through and vote for the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. So they don't have a vested interest in it. They don't have an understanding of it. 12 of the 25 Republican Ways and Means, that's the committee that has jurisdiction over the tax legislation, they weren't here in 2017. 15 of the 18 Democrats on the Ways and Means Committee weren't here. So we've been spending a lot of time working with those members of Congress in particular to bring them up to speed to say, this is why the 199A deduction is so important to our members. This is why this is what the industry is and what we do. This is why if you're looking to offset some of those expenses, why it matters to us. So we're doing and have been doing that education effort now, because after the election, we know before the first challenge happens, we're going to have 16 60 new members of Congress, because 60 members of the current 118th Congress has said, we're either not running for office, we're running for a different office, we're retiring. Some have actually passed. So we know we're going to have at least 60 new people to educate and bring up to speed, in addition to those that are already there. And the Senate, it's a similar situation. You look at 19% haven't voted for TCJA. 5 of the 13 Republicans on the Senate Finance Committee weren't here. 7 of the 14 Democrats on the Senate Finance Committee, and that would be the Senate committee that has jurisdiction, weren't here. So there's a huge education effort going on, and has been going on, to bring those that are in Congress up to speed and understanding our issues, so that when the freshman class comes in, we can turn to them. We obviously always want to start with the committees of jurisdiction, because they're going to have the first input on the legislation. But when it comes down to it, every member of Congress is going to have a vote. So we need to make sure that we're touching and educating each and every one of them. So what does it look like? I mentioned that if the elections are going to sort of shape what the tax policy looks like. After the election, if you have a Democrat trifecta, that means you have a Democratic administration, they have a majority in the Senate, and they have a majority in the House. What can you look or expect of them to start with? They're going to probably allow the 2017 individual tax rates to expire. You're going to see an increase in the corporate tax rate. You'll see efforts focusing on taxpayers with over $400,000 worth of income. They'll tax unrealized gain. They'll hike up the net investment income tax. You can look and expect a reduction in the state tax exclusion, Roth conversions and backdoors, non-qualified deferred comp, an extension of the ACA subsidies. That'll be their focus if you have a dim sweep. And so obviously that comes with its own set of challenges. But if you look at divided government, let's flip to the next slide. It's still challenging. It really doesn't matter what scenario I paint for you. We're still going to have challenges, but they're going to be different challenges. So if you have a divided government, you're going to see that there has to be a negotiation on some of the individual provisions and the targeted provisions to expire. So they'll actually look at that 2017 TCJA and figure out which components do we want to keep, which components do we want to go away. I still think in a divided government, you'll probably see a raise in the corporate rate. Both campaigns for president have come out and said, you know, we're not going to tax tips. If you remove that tax from the tips, that's going to increase the cost of that $4.5 trillion bill. There have been, even since they pulled the slide together, you're seeing, and these are campaign talks. It's going to take Congress to actually move, but the presidential campaigns keep getting, you know, one-upping each other on what can we do to bring in a specific segment of society, but promising some type of tax incentive. And so you've seen the Trump campaign come out and say, in addition to the taxable tips, that they're going to look at, I think the latest was on Social Security. There was something else that they were looking at doing. Oh, the price of generators would be fully deductible. And that was in reaction to the hurricanes that we just saw. So you keep seeing these new proposals. On the Harris administration came out and said, we're going to fund caregiving through Medicare. All of these things, the campaigns or the president couldn't do on their own. So it still would be part of that overall negotiation, depending on what mix you have. We can go to the Republican trifecta. If you look at the Republican trifecta, so again, the divided government could be any combination. It could be Republican administration, House controlled by the Democrats, Senate controlled by the Republicans, or any combination of those. You can flip those up anyway. The Republican trifecta, again, would be Republican administration, control of the Senate, control of the House. This is where you're going to see a greater focus on making the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. That's going to be their focus. They're going to, if you listen to Trump, he's saying they would lower the corporate rates even further. I think in the negotiations that probably unlikely, but we'll see because of the cost of the overall bill. And you have a number of individuals that are concerned about that, the greater deficit. Rolling back some of the Inflation Reduction Act provisions, repealing some of the IRS enforcement funding boosts that they got would be repealed, eliminating taxes. I mentioned that on Social Security. There are a number of different initiatives that would be in play if you had a Republican Trump happen. So are different methods that can be used to positively influence policy. And it's very much like your businesses. If you think about how you develop business, you're developing relationship, you're making investments, you're relying on experienced professionals, you have some type of media or marketing exposure, and then you're effectively engaging with your clients. And that's very much what we do on the legislative side as well. Go ahead and what there are a number of different ways that you can engage to influence policy. And they're actually, I think, quite fun, but I tend to be a policy nerd, so I love all of this, but they really are. If you come to DC, if you're working with legislators, it can be really fun. Let's go ahead and flip through. One of the first ways is to get involved in your state legislative days. I know Texas has its 100th anniversary coming up, and they'll do a state legislative day and component as a component of that. Really great way to get involved and get started. You don't have to go too far, though Texas is pretty spread out. But for most people, state's easier. You come to DC, participate in congressional visits. So there's a congressional conference. We have a leadership conference periodically that's in DC. There are different groups that will have specific fly-ins. We have a women's financial security fly-in in March that's sponsored by a number of different companies, and that invitation is through those companies. And then companies also have company-specific events that they'll ask NAIFA to facilitate for them. So your company may be asking you to participate in any. Take advantage of that. If invited or have the opportunity to participate in any of those events, you should, because it really does, hearing directly from the constituent versus from the lobbyist, which I don't want to talk myself out of the job, but it's that combination that really makes legislators go, oh, okay, that's true in my district, and I'm hearing that from my constituents. That's really important. So it's a great time. It does make a difference in policy, and I would encourage you to participate. Go on. If you're not inclined to come to DC, or if you have a conflict, there's site visits. You can invite a legislator to come to your office. It's a great way to introduce them to what we do as an industry. We also have in-district events where NAIFA will facilitate meetings with lawmakers. Another great way to participate, start getting to know those legislators. More importantly, they need to get to know you and understand what you do for your clients / their constituents. Making that tie really helps move the needle on public policy. Another thing that you can do if you're interested in legislation and making a difference in advocacy is to earn your FSA badge. And it's a financial security advocate. It's a 6-part series, super easy to go through. I was so excited when we first started it. We partnered with the Congressional Management Foundation, which studies Congress and says, what actions would actually cause a legislator who is inclined to vote one way to change their opinion. And so they do a lot of deep dive analysis of members of the Congress and how to work with them. And so it's a series of 6 really short videos that you go through. There's a little test at the end. You can't fail it, but it's to gauge your understanding of how to work with them and what really makes a difference. I think it's super fun. I did it in the airport because I was so excited when it first came out. So it can be done just about anywhere once you register. And it gives you an insight of what you can do to develop a stronger relationship with members of Congress. Because ideally what we want is when they start looking at legislation or to make changes that would impact your industry and the way that you serve your clients, that they're calling you. And so earning this financial security advocate badge or going through the academy allows you to obtain that information. So it can be super helpful. And I think fun. The Congressional Conference I mentioned as one of the NDC type events. It's held every year the week before Memorial Day. So mark your calendars. And 2025 is going to be the 19th and 20th. Registration should be opening soon. I think you can go, if you scan the QR code, I think it allows you to type in your information and get a notification when registration opens so that you can get in. There are usually stipends available to help offset the cost of coming to DC. And again, we're going to be in the throes of tax reform come May. And we need everyone who is physically able to come and participate. A lot of times I'll hear comments from, well, my legislator actually understands what our industry does and they don't need to hear from me. They're good to go. They vote in favor of the industry all of the time. So why should I come to DC? Twofold. One is that members talk to members. So if you're there and saying, hey, this is really important and I need you to talk to your colleagues because you obviously understand the importance of the industry, but we need to make sure that we're touching others. Really important to do that. The optics of having members from every state, which we consistently do year in and year out, gives us an optic on the hill of, oh my gosh, the financial services industry is everywhere. I know these agents and advisors are going to be weighing in, and it's important to them. It causes them to pay attention. So the sheer magnitude of people coming, and it's easy to do. We give you a briefing before we go to the Hill, talk about what you need to do. You'll have people like John Wheeler, who's going to be there, who's done this a million times. So if you've never done it before, you can partner up with John and he'll tell you how to do it. But honestly, if you walk into a member's office and just say, I'm with NAIFA, and I'm here to help and I have some concerns. That's all you need to say and tell your story of how you work with clients. Tremendous value, tremendous value. We'll circle in and fill all of the details if we're into detailed legislation at that moment. The legislators don't expect you to know the ins and outs of the legislation or the legislative process. What they want from you, which is what you do better than anyone else, is talk about how you work with the clients. That's what they need to hear. And I can go in and do it for you, but without fail, they'll say, Diane, that's great. I believe that's true, but is it true in my district? And then I have to have that validation from a constituent. That's where you guys come in. All right, if we want to look forward, we have a PAC. The cost of campaigns is incredibly expensive. If you look at the average cost of a Senate winner, it's $27 million to win a race. We are capped at how much our PAC can contribute to those races. It's $10,000 typically. If there is a runoff or a special election, you can generally do an additional $5,000. So $15,000 max is all that we can ever give to a given candidate. That's not buying the vote. Those are some of the challenges that you get on the PAC. It's simply not true. But what it does say is, look, we recognize how expensive it is to run for office, and we want to make sure that we help get people who understand our industry elected. That's why we're here. It starts building that relationship and that credibility with the lawmaker. I just think it's fun to look at the most expensive because I think we're going to top it in 2024, but in 2022, it was $260 million in the Georgia Senate race. Let's go ahead and move on. Life cycle of advocacy is basically members will contribute to the PAC. IFAPAC supports the candidates to get them elected. We develop the relationships with them. Elected officers, officials become receptive to meeting with people that they know and trust. And we've established that trust and credibility through supporting their campaigns. And then, as I said, NAIFA members are then relied upon by those legislators when they're having to make decisions and cast a vote. So that's how we get that momentum going on positively influencing legislation. We have an advocacy action center. If you haven't visited it, I highly encourage that you do. It will show their contribution levels to the PAC. It will allow you to see the different reporter relationship. If you know your legislator and want to share that information with us, there's an opportunity to do that. Talks about our issues, that what are we working on currently. Bunch of fun stuff there.
What do you think the odds are of something like ERAT coming back, the excess retirement accumulations tax that we had years ago, where anything above was 150,000 indexed at that time was then 10% surcharge. Do you see something like that potentially coming back in, since retirement contribution deductions and retirement savings is such a big issue? Because again, that's hitting what in Congress's mind is the higher income.
Ask me after November 5th, but yes. But yes, no, I mean, that all of that is on the table, and it's going to be interesting. A lot of it really does depend on what the makeup of Congress is.
Right.
If you end up with a sweep one way or another, they're going to push through something in reconciliation, which means that they don't need 60 votes in the Senate. It does require them to limit how much can be done in that package. But that's one way. If it's a divided government, then I think we have a different scenario than if you're running something through reconciliation on one side or the other. And even with the difference between the two trifectas would be significant as far as how that's played. And even then, even if you have a trifecta, what are the margins in the Senate? I still think the margins are going to be so small. And then it depends on what type of candidate actually got in. And so are you seeing a Democratic House that leans more to the right? Will they negotiate if there's a Republican Senate? Maybe. Will they moderate? Then maybe you don't run into some of the scenarios that you just proposed on. If you have a Democratic, let's say with the likelihood is more that the House would flip to Dem and the Senate would flip to Republican. So let's stay with that scenario. If you had a Democratic House, but they're more progressive, they're more left. You have a Senate that is Republican controlled, but they're only going to have a seat or two. Then where's the administration? Is the administration Republican or is the administration Democrat? And then that may drive more progressive policies or more conservative policies. And then with the conservative policies, and John, you remember this from 2017, there was a push for Roth only. So even if you have a Republican trifecta, or there going to be tinkerings with changing to try to generate revenue on the front end. And we also saw in 2017, there were talks about, and at that time, there was a Republican trifecta. There were talks of what changes do we make to 401ks so that we can generate some revenue to pay for this legislation. And Trump came out with a tweet. That's all it took. He put out a tweet and says, "No, it's going to touch your 401ks. It's good policy." So Republicans are like, well, I guess we can't go there. Back up, back up, back up. So it really does matter who's in office. The administrations can't put through policy completely on their own, but depending on who the president is, they may or may not have the ability to influence Congress in their discussions of what direction we take. So we're waiting to see. In the meantime, we're doing our education of lawmakers that are there so that they have an understanding. The best thing that we can do as an industry is to make sure they understand the value that our products and services provide to their constituents. Once they get that, then they sort of take pause when they start trying to find that revenue. And hopefully we'll look elsewhere.
Yeah, I think when Congress all of a sudden started talking lost revenues, like everything's theirs to begin with, that changed the whole complexion of thing. And that's where it's so important that we educate the people because again, like you mentioned, there's roughly 60 people that don't know anything about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and don't understand our industry. So it's always important that we're there to help educate them, to help them understand the unintended consequences. Because if you're only looking at the numbers, okay, that's easy. But what is the cause and effect? Taxation is one way to raise revenue. So is increased economy. If we have more earnings that then are just taxed naturally, that's going to help. And, what can help generate that as well. So it's that delicate balancing act.
Yeah, it definitely is. And we'll see where it all shakes out as we get started post election, but the games will begin. Thank you, because really the work that you guys do is meaningful. It's good for the American public. And I think once we have those conversations with the legislators, they generally see it. We've been leveraging a lot of the Life Happens material. I don't know if you guys were able to participate this morning. Today is actually, we celebrate Life Happens 30th anniversary of coming into existence. And that consumer education component is really helpful because we've been using that with lawmakers too. They're not necessarily, well, they are consumers, but they're consumers that also have a vote in how your business can operate and run. But getting them, that was another quiver in their arrow, if you will, to figure out, to share those stories, to have that impact, just as we try to influence consumers to understand the value of their products. It's a really good way to have those conversations with the legislators. And we showed a real life story video with every member of the Ways and Means Committee, every member of the Senate Finance Committee. We tried to pull the videos that correspond with their state so that there's a personal connection there. And for those where we didn't have a real life stories video, which we're still trying to collect those. So if anybody has stories, please share, please share, please share. Encourage your colleagues to share their stories. Everybody has one, but if you have a constituent or a client that's willing to tell that story on camera, it's so impactful. And on top of that, for those where we didn't have a real life story, we were sharing where scholarships had gone out in their state. And so the Life Lesson Scholarship rewards students for sharing their story of how a parent died without coverage and what it meant to them. And as they're coming into college and, many of them had worked jobs and obviously trying to help whatever the surviving parent was to get through, taking care of younger siblings. I mean, the stories that these kids tell are just heart-wrenching. And when we can show that as well, it shows both the good of the industry and what happens when the industry isn't there to protect people, I think is just as important. And we had a chance with Congressman French Hill from Arkansas to share one of those scholarship stories. And you could just see the emotion. He understands our industry, but the emotion that it causes when people see those stories, it makes that connection. And when you have that emotional connection, it works really well with the policy because you're not, as John said, you're not just looking at the numbers. You're actually remembering the people that were impacted. And that's what we want them to do because they're working in 10-year windows. So it's really hard to figure out how does this play for the long run when you're, you know, working in a budget that's this big. We're talking about an industry that really is talking about protecting people's financial futures. And so it's hard to get them to see beyond the 10-year window. But when you have that emotional connection, it helps humanize the issue, and it really makes it much easier to go in and have those conversations, or at least causes them to have pause and to pick up the phone and say, hey, John, tell me more. What would the impact be? And that's where we want to be.
And I think it's important to also continually remind them, we create dollars that didn't exist before. So, you know, when you're talking about paying off the deficit or funding the interest on the deficit or doing anything for the economy, we're the only industry that creates dollars that didn't exist before by encouraging people to help themselves, as opposed to relying on government action. And, you know, if Congress fully understood that, they'd be the biggest proponent of our industry, and they'd insist on people buying our products to create that cushion that the world needs.
Diane, thank you so much for doing this for us this morning, for being here, for taking the time out of your day. And I mean, just all of the work that you and your teams are doing is so needed for not just us, but all professionals across the country, and for the American people. So thank you again.
Thank you. Have a great
Thank you,
afternoon,
Diane.
guys.
Take care.
Thank you,
Travel safe.
Diane. Bye-bye.